Hello, my name is Kendall Barnes, and this is Creature Conflict, an audio podcast aimed to inform people about invasive species. In this episode, listen to my interview with Dr. Amy Fowler. Have you had any experience with lag phenomena in the um, species that you've been researching at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of invasive species undergo what we term the lag phase, right? That's the phase where it's after they've been introduced, or at least some of them have been introduced, until we as humans start to notice them, right? And that's usually because the first introduction is usually a small number of individuals, right? And it takes subsequent introductions of both frequency of introductions, but number of individuals per introduction event, a term called propagule pressure, to kind of increase the number of organisms that you might have in a localized area, right? So it's going to take a little bit of time for people to notice that it's a new thing, right? And so that's termed the lag phase. So, for example, for the crabs in all the different locations where it's now known, there definitely was a lag phase of when we think they were introduced and when people actually started to notice them. Definitely. I'm not sure about the snails. The history of the snails and people reporting them is a little less clear. Nowadays, you have things like iNaturalist and other types of like citizen science um, programs, which are fantastic because people that are interacting, with their wildlife may be more in tune to what looks different, right? That are maybe going to the same fishing spot multiple times a week, right? And if they catch something different, they're like, "Ooh, this is really different. I've never seen this before." And then they put that on iNaturalist. That might gather somebody's attention, like, "Ooh, this is something really different," or "This doesn't belong here," right? So a lot of times, as researchers, we actually look to the public to help us locate where these species are. Um, for our work on mystery snails, for example, we are looking for places, especially around like North Carolina, Maryland, Delaware, where we can go out and sample them to figure out genetically who they are. And we use iNaturalist to help us figure out where to go because we can see in the picture quite clearly, is that snail alive or dead? Maybe they've posted a picture with multiple ones, so you know there's a bunch of them there, right? And you can usually at least tell, okay, that's a mystery snail, or it's probably not a mystery snail. It's probably something else. So that's actually really helpful in kind of figuring out where to go and where to sample. Yeah.
So why is it so difficult to remove these established invasive species? Plants or animals or parasites?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for somewhere like the ocean, right, which is interconnected and the water is, moving and everything, it's very difficult to know that a particular species is localized in a particular area and be able to get rid of it. Let's just take lionfish, for example. Lionfish are now located off the coast of, I think, Virginia, all the way south, right, on wrecks, and they're associated with like habitat, offshore. But the ability to go out and literally sample all of that water and collect all of those fish and get rid of them is impossible. There's just no way you're going to be able to do that. You don't have the money, the time, or the resources to do that. So that's one thing, is getting rid of the adults, right? But you also have to then also get rid of all of the juveniles or the smaller organisms, some of which have a planktonic stage, which is microscopic. So trying to literally filter the ocean for some of these organisms once they're there in a particular place would be almost impossible. So unless you're able to, cordon off an area and essentially fumigate it, um, it's very hard. There are some examples in marine systems. There's a really famous one in Darwin, Australia, where they found, I think it was a tunicate, could be a sponge, but I think it's a tunicate that they found in a marina. And they basically shut the marina off, closed it off with tarps and things like that. And then they went around, and the tunicate was on these pilings, that hold the docks up. And they covered all of the pilings with plastic, and then put a bleach solution, a liquid solution in there, and killed everything in there. And then they poured bleach into the water column. And so they essentially just killed everything that was in there. And the tunicate wasn't found again. So those are the types of really drastic measures that you have to do. But again, it has to be localized. You have to be able to cut it off and be able to do something about it. There's another cool example of an algae that is used in the bait trade out of Maine. There's a whole trade in Maine that works on these. You may have heard of them. They're called bloodworms. People buy them to fish. They like them because they don't have blood like you and me, but their blood is red, and so they bleed, and they think the fish really like them or whatever. But they pack them in Maine. They pack the worms with algae. And so people that think they're doing a good job, after they use the bait, they throw the algae out and like in the intertidal. And it was introduced into California. And so there's been a couple of attempts. One was really successful, to go around and hand collect all the algae, just pull it out. And of course, it costs tens of thousands of dollars to do that, but they were able to remove the algae from colonizing those particular areas. So that's a good example. In freshwater systems, sometimes in a closed lake or a closed pond, you can use chemicals, usually chemicals, to be able to eradicate fish or snails or algae or something like that. So that's been really useful. I want to mention one other really cool example of an eradication. So in New Zealand, I can't remember when this was, maybe 20 years ago. I can't remember. They have this strategy of sinking old vessels or old equipment in the ocean to create wrecks that then, fish will come to, and then divers can come to. And so they dropped this, I think it was a boat, like a big boat. And when they went out to survey it later, they found that there was an invasive seaweed that was attached to it. And New Zealand, because this is in the marine system, didn't want to pump a bunch of chemicals into the marine system. So what they used was heat. So they went down and they basically took heat and UV and just went across all over the boat and got rid of all the algae and all the little like sporophytes, the little baby algae that were all over the boat. And so that was another really interesting method of using heat to kind of, kill these organisms really effectively. So those are kind of some common, methods of trying to get rid of things, mostly surrounding chemicals and things like that, to eradicate them, or hand collection.
So you mentioned this obviously. The chemicals being used as a means of eradication, but those can have a lot of, negative effects. I read about a lake in New York, I believe it was, that was completely destroyed because they were trying to get rid of the northern snakehead from it.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah, I mean, obviously you're killing the target species, but you are killing everything else in there, right? That also is susceptible to whatever these things are. And so, for fish, I've heard that they try to sometimes, take out genetic stock before um, they chemically, treat a location or something like that. But yeah, and so nowadays it's really difficult to get permitting for that kind of stuff, right? Like we're talking about, in the earlier 60s, 70s, 80s. But now it's very difficult to it's very difficult to get that managed in that way, for precisely that reason. Yeah.
So while we're on the topic of, eradication or removal, I wanted to ask you if you had heard about molecular genetics or genetic engineering as a means of control of invasive species?
I have not heard of it as a means of control. I've heard of it as a means of detection, at least that I know that's been employed, um, like in the field. So I know that there are ways to use eDNA, for example, environmental DNA, to identify locations where invasive species might be during that lag phase before they become a problem. And so it's a way to kind of target areas um, to sample, or as a first means of detection, for example. Um, I mean, I've heard of this in terms of mosquitoes. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. So the article that I read two articles. One of them was about genetically engineered mosquitoes in Great Britain. I don't remember. I believe they're tiger mosquitoes. And they're targeting a gene that will then essentially lessen and lessen and lessen the population. And I believe they're doing something very similar in Australia.
Hmm.
So I was just wondering, had you heard of it, and like, do you think it would be a more widespread, like, effective means of, eradicating invasive species?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one because, like, you've got to think about the ecology of the species and the population density of the species and the reproduction of the species to know whether or not that might work. I definitely have heard about it for mosquitoes, but that's all I've heard of, right? So when you think
Yeah.
about something um like a snail, for example, like I can't imagine that would work. I mean, maybe, but I just can't imagine because they don't, or other types of species. I mean, the only thing I can think of, uh, there might be some of this kind of going on with particular um, oysters. So they don't have XY chromosomes. They have other types of chromosomes. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what, but you could get diploid or triploid oysters. And that has to do with decreasing the chances that some of these strains that are used in aquaculture would be able to get out and hybridize with native species or be able to spread and things like that. So it's used both to create bigger oysters that sell better, like they take on meat a lot more. So I don't know if it's necessarily an invasive species thing, or it's just how can we produce oysters that don't put a lot of energy into reproduction and instead put energy into creating more meat. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. It's something I, read a little bit about, and I found it extremely interesting, and just wanted to know if that was more so widely applicable than, to just mosquitoes.
I
Um,
don't know much about it. Sorry.
no, that's totally fine. It's kind of my final question, what do you want people to, take away from this episode, and, what's something important that you want people to know, or even just anything you want to add that you want people to know?
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest things is that everybody can help us kind of prevent invasive species and the movement of species that into areas which they are not native to. And I think that there's a lot of ways that people can be cognizant of maybe what they're doing that you might not think, oh well, this is actually a vector for moving species from place to place, right? So I'm going to give you a quick list that I have over here. so so one is to make sure that if you are a fisherman or um, you're going out into the water, for example, that you clean your boots or you clean your equipment that you're using for whatever activity before going to like a new water body, because there could be, very small organisms that are associated with whatever that you're doing, right? And this is true for your own equipment, but also your boats, right? Or anything that you're using. The other thing that I think is something that might not come to people is firewood. So people might be moving firewood across state lines or from one type of ecosystem to another type of ecosystem. Like you're taking firewood to your log cabin, right? Or vice versa. And so those pieces of wood might contain a various assortment of insects or other types of, or even eggs, larvae and other types of things. So just making sure that you're not doing those things. Um, One big one would be don't release aquarium pets. So there's lots of places that you can actually donate aquarium pets. I don't know if they still do it, but like PetSmart or what's the other one? Any of the pet stores, basically, you can call and ask them if you can, surrender your pet and not let it go. I mean, there's other ways you can humanely do these things, put them in the freezer and let them slowly, sleep to death, or there's other ways that you can, dispose of those animals. Um, Another cool thing is you can volunteer. There's lots of ways you could volunteer to get involved in your community. So you could volunteer to remove invasive species. This is a big thing for plants in particular. So removing invasive plants and maybe replanting with native species. So there's many groups throughout Virginia that do these types of things, especially in the summer. So that would be really a great way to get involved. Um, and then lastly, kind of what I mentioned about the iNaturalist thing. If you do go and spend a lot of time outdoors or go to your favorite, stream all the time and you notice something that's different, tell people, report it, on iNaturalist, or find somebody at the university who works on invasive species close to you or something like that and report that you see this weird thing. And it could be that you've discovered something new in the area. And that would be great because we do rely on people that are out, in the environment to tell us things and to show us things. So those would be kind of my biggest takeaways that people maybe hope to get, is you can make a difference too, I think.
That concludes the second half of my interview with Dr. Amy Fowler. Thank you for listening, and please tune into my other episodes.